Hello everyone, Tony here, and I'm letting you know that Dwayne and I will be taking Tree Actions live. On March 27th and 28th of this year, we will be at Arbor Expo at the New Jersey Convention and Exposition Center in Edison, New Jersey. Come join us for the tree industry's fastest growing trade show and conference. This year features 19 education sessions, 2 of which I will be delivering, as well as all the exhibitors and demos you can expect from an excellent trade show and conference. We will look forward to seeing you there.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tree Actions, the Human Forestry Podcast. And as always, joining me in the technical background are my co-host, Tony Trusselt, and today all the way from Princeton, British Columbia, near Princeton, is longtime friend and colleague, Blair Veitch. How's it going, Blair?
It's going great, and good morning, Dwayne.
So, we always get things started, Blair, by asking people their first experience when they felt a kind of a connection to a tree, wherever and however that was. And that's kind of how we always just start the podcast off. And the reason I'm hesitating is we've had a couple people not necessarily know who each other is or everybody on our show. So maybe you could just give us also just a bit of a background on yourself and your journey. But if you could tie in that first experience, maybe that's too much, but I've never tried this before. So as far as the background part goes, so I'm learning as I go, and you'll find that we're Tree Actions as such remains unorganized.
Yeah, that's a great question because I think for a lot of us, the journey to where we are now in our life is, long and storied. And, I think my earliest recollection and attraction to trees was we had a 60-foot white spruce in our yard, and much to my mother's dismay, I would climb that almost on a daily basis, and I'd see how close to the top I could get, and she would yell at me to come down out of the tree. Of course, both my sisters were older than me, so they were already in school. So I would have been like 4 or 5 years old at the time, and nothing else to do. No sisters to bug, so I was climbing the trees. But I think as time progressed for me, I grew up on a small farm sawmill logging operation, and so I had the chance to go with my father logging, and I kind of enjoyed that part of it, being out in the bush. And I got my first chainsaw for Christmas when I turned 13, and my birthday and Christmas are very close together, so I quite often got 2 gifts or 1 gift for both events. Right. And I was so proud of that chainsaw. I spent many hours out in the bush with my father logging.
So I guess I'd be remiss, because if I'm not the only one, I'm sure that's thinking it. What was it? What kind of chainsaw did you get?
We called it the lemon limmer because my dad did the falling and I did the limbing. So, it was Alberta and the trees had lots of brush on them, but it was a little McCullough. It was actually a top handle. It was probably one of the most dangerous saws because it didn't have a chain brake or anything on it, and had a 13-inch bar, and it was just a terrible little saw. But we kept it running and kept it working, and I was pretty proud of that saw. We still have it to this day.
I was going to say those. I remember those McCulloughs, and there's knowing you, it's probably still around. And and that may be one of the first top handles. I would say it was definitely in the first generation of top handles.
Yeah, it had a pump oiler, so you had to keep pumping the oiler to keep the chain.
And what did you use Barrow, or were you using whatever oil you had? Do you know?
We actually did use bar oil because it was a little stringier and held things together a little better.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So how did your journey progress into the trees?
Well, for me, because I had to do it my whole life growing up, like most kids, you hate doing it after a while because it's just work and it's no fun. So I told my father I would never be in the tree business, never be a logger, never have anything to do with sawmills. And of course, I graduated high school in '82, and the first thing I did is went and got a job with High Tree, which eventually was bought out by Davy Tree. Um, and I never really had a passion for trees for probably 3 or 4 years. And then once I discovered that there was something more than just utility work, I began to have a passion for tree biology, the anatomy of trees, how things functioned, what made things tick, and started studying and learning about it. And it soon became my, overreaching passion that I just, it consumed me and became my passion of my career.
Well, I've certainly witnessed that, Blair. I've known you a long time, and there's no question your passion for what you do is undeniable. What was the spark that you recall, like that when that shift occurred? What was it? A person? Was it an event? But what made that shift for you?
I think being part of Davy Tree, and seeing the education that was offered. And of course, I had never had that opportunity before, so this was a new thing for me. And once I started doing the extension courses and the extended learning, I just became really passionate about it. And of course, that's when I moved from our utility operation to residential in the Edmonton area, and that was the start of my arboriculture career as it is. And I think probably some of the most significant learning events in my career, particularly out in the field, were the tree climbing competitions that we had, every year, and a lot of the training events that we, both took part in and did. And of course, you went on to making that your very successful career. And it was just, to me, that was probably the highlights of, and in terms of teaching moments, learning moments, was a lot of those events. I think they're critical to everyone's career, and just the ability to stay with the industry.
I know that you did climbing. Like, how did you obviously climbed trees as a young lad, but when were you climbing in the utility realm, and then did it shift as you went into residential commercial, or how did your climbing career evolve?
Yeah, typical Alberta, we did a lot of aspens, black poplars, spruce, pine, and quite often, because some of our foremen were a little on the older side, we would get a lot of opportunity to climb. So I did climb for 2 or 3 years in utility, and then switched over to residential in the Edmonton area, and climbed there for a couple of years before I took over as the manager in that area. So yeah, it was a great opportunity, and then of course, climbing competitively was so much fun and enjoyable, and the camaraderie that took place there was just undeniable, and how everybody worked together.
So, do you remember your first time climbing, like non-free climbing, like actually using a harness? Do you remember what you used in the system?
Yeah, I mean, we were that I think went before the Blake or any hitch, because we were using a closed loop system at the time, and so every time you went to move, you had to untie and retie, and it was pretty cumbersome. And by comparison to today's standards, you wonder how we even did it, but we did. I think it was one of the reasons why we free climbed a lot more than we did tied in, because it was just so cumbersome to get tied in every time. And we were using the flat scare straps. That's what we called them at the time, to tie in with when we climbed as well back then. So there was really no safety mechanism at all.
So the scare straps, yeah. Now that was probably in the utility realm somewhat inherited because of the connection with the lineman industry, I would think, eh?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And you not only competed, but you were also got involved in helping run the competitions in our chapter as well in the early years, as a competitor and as the chair.
Yeah, I think I chaired the Prairie Chapter event for close to 10 years. And that was, always really good time and a very good opportunity for education and training in all of those events. It was really great.
Well, your career in the trees has been, you've always, I think it would be fair to say, like your climbing career, you climbed near as to the top as you could get, and I think you've continued on with that in your career. But also moving, like when you made the decision to move, um, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that journey, because that's quite a leap, from going from the Alberta to the BC market. Not I remember you one time talking to me about your first experience in looking at the trees, and you made some mistakes in pricing and this because you lose sight of the scale of things. Uh,
That's good memory because, yeah, 120-foot hemlock looks small by comparison to 150-foot Doug fir standing beside it. And so it's very easy to assume that tree is small. But yeah, the whole move from Alberta to BC, particularly to Vancouver, where I moved, was an opportunity I had back in the late '90s, early 2000s, and it really did open my eyes in terms of the size of wood at the coast, and how to deal with it and how to deal with it safely, because that's obviously the key to everyday work in the tree industry, is ensuring that you have every risk accounted for prior to making a move. And with the size of wood that we have at the coast, it's very critical. So it was a big learning curve. Even the tree species were a big learning curve, going from 5 or 6 main species in Alberta to 50 or 60 at the coast.
yeah, yeah. It's always I remember doing climbing courses in the West Coast my first few years out there, and throw lining, and there was one fir in the one park in particular. The first limb was 120 some feet. It was quite a large lateral, and it would be like it was all I could do to get. There was on my good day I could actually get a shot over that first limb, and there was a big leaf maple that we would climb in beside it that you just didn't realize you were tying in your normal working height. I think on those trees are like 80, 90 feet or 70 feet, 80, which is the very tippity tips of the tallest trees around here. And you'd always have to put into perspective how hard you had to throw, because I'd come from doing a course here, and then the next week I would be training there, and I'd go to throw in, and I'm used to throwing 40 to 50 to a suitable union, and now I'm like falling, not even into the first branch, and my throw line's falling short. And it's like, what the heck? Oh yeah, this tree doesn't look that big, but oh no, it is, because it's sitting underneath 300-foot Doug firs, and it's a 110-foot tree itself, or 120. But it's just the scale. It's interesting how it just all blends in, And I remember talking to you about it and you sharing that, and I thought, yeah, good thing. And I never had connected the estimate part of it, because I would have gotten slaughtered trying to.
Yeah, I think we all did. Everybody took their punches.
No doubt.
Yeah, I mean, some of those trees like you're talking about, where you got to, big shot in with a fishing line, and then get in with a throw line after that, and then pull your rope into position. Just a real challenge to do anything with.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. Blair, there's a few people that have been in my life and that I've observed that I know well, like yourself, and some that I know, more of an acquaintance, but that I've observed over the years that have found a way to not only their career is a demonstration of their success, but also their personal life and their own personal fitness and self-care. And that's something that I've always admired about you. And I've always wondered, have you ever drawn a parallel to your journey in that way in trees, or where did you get that from for yourself? That this ability, you've always been active in the gym, active in sports, like throughout your entire career. There's a lot of people like myself who figured it out later in life. But there's a lot of people get into a position like yours, moving into manager and leadership roles, and not being in the trees anymore. Their lifestyle affects that, and it affects their health in some ways with not being as active, let's say. And you've always maintained that, and I think of Mark Chisholm, who we had on the show not that long ago, and he's an example of that. Where did that come from, would you say, and how could you pass that on to young folks out there?
Yeah, Mark certainly is an example of that. He definitely seems to keep a good balance. For me, I think I had some examples within our own business of what not to be like health wise, and so I kind of vowed early on in my career when I switched from climbing over to sales and management and supervision type thing that I would not get in the position where I was having health issues at 50 or 55 just because of inactivity. So, and I spent a lot of time with our younger guys because when they switch over from that active climbing every day to sales or management, they tend to fall into that groove where they become sedentary. And so for me, it's just always been something that I want to ensure that I keep my physical health. I want to live past my retirement if it's at all within my control, so that I have some time to enjoy when I'm finished my career. And it's always been a good balance. Of course, my wife, she is the same, so it's very good to have a partner. And in my case, I'm very lucky to have a partner like that stays active and pushes me a little bit on days that I don't feel like it, and vice versa, I'm sure. But it's always been a critical part of my career to stay in reasonably good shape and to stay in a position where I can be healthy throughout my life.
So when you made the transition and you were faced with that, do I become more sedentary? And I think also the shift that requires, you go from like quite an intensity, like it's quite a dramatic shift from estimator. You have a truck, you drive around, you talk to people, you sell work, which is kind of the next step for a lot of arborists, whether they start their own business or they move up in sales in a company like Davy. But it's such a dramatic shift from production tree work. I mean, there's very few jobs that are, whether you're climbing and cutting or it's just stuffing a chipper, I don't care. It's tough work, and it's quite a transition. So, for me, what I found, what I struggled with for a long time was what I would get down on myself for not being at the level I was when I was in that active role. And it actually took me to a place where I felt like it wasn't, well, what's the point? Because I'm nowhere near what I was. And in that moment, I demoralized myself, so to speak. So how much, like I'm just curious, I guess I should put it differently. I found finally that it really isn't that much to, just busting a move every day of sorts. Like as little as going for a walk for me these days makes such a big difference. Did you find that transition to be that way, or like as far as intensity or what it took?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for me, it's I won't say it's been a roller coaster, but it's had a lot of ups and downs throughout the years. Trying to stay focused on like you say, you are not nearly at the intensity, and I believe that the job of an arborist is probably one of the most difficult on the face of the earth. I mean, moving your body through a tree with gear and chainsaws and potentially pieces of wood is incredibly physically demanding. And so to come from that to even a hybrid model, you're not nearly in the shape you were in. Sometimes you don't have the aches and pains you had either because of the, injuries. But I think for me, it's just been the same as what you're saying. It's some days you think this isn't even worth it. Like, I'm not nearly where I used to be. How am I going to get back there? But like you say, it's just, moving.
Yep.
And that's what's been critical for me, just not to stop altogether, but just to keep moving. And I think that, you've got an incredible pile of energy, and I've always admired you for that. And it's within us to want to move and to want to do it. And I think that's helped me in my career. I know it's helped you in your career. Delivering energy to a group of folks comes from deep within. And I think even in my current position as vice president, general manager of our Canadian operations, I know that when I come into a room, I have to deliver energy. It's critical, whether we're talking on a Teams meeting or Zoom, or whether we're physically together, that we have to, as leaders, we have to deliver energy, and that's always been part of it for me too. You have to present to your group or to other groups that you have energy and a willingness to use it. And I think, staying fit is part of that delivery.
Yeah. Oh no, Tony, you've walked similar path. I know that you have you're an example of this as well. I'm curious what your because you're not a spring chicken anymore.
What are you saying, Dwayne? Yeah, I think the biggest change for me at that point in my career was I hadn't realized how much just my job kept me fit. I always figured that I never really did any training or anything outside of work because I just didn't feel like it. And I hadn't realized how much physical activity was involved in it until you step away from it and go to it. And then I think for me, when I got to that realization, in my 50s, I'm not 21 anymore. I admit it, and I embrace it now, I think. But I think the realization is it's like, I don't think there's much any humans can do to extend the number of days you actually live, right? I think so much of that's decided, short of reckless driving, but what you can increase is your span of health. I don't think you can increase your span of life. I think you can increase your span of health. So when I got to the point now where it's like, I'm not 21 anymore and climbing trees left and right with no recrimination and no recovery time. I like to think that all that blended in, and now I'm actually fortunate I can do less and get the same amount of benefits, right? So it's been an interesting, and I do admire people like Blair that have kept with it, because it's easy to fall into that trap of like, well, I'm not what I was when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. Why even bother to try? But it is worth trying, right? It is worth trying, because you might not expand the number of days you live, but you expand the quality of those days that you are alive.
I always think I guess I'm on this human forest theme these days, and I'm brought back to it, every time we do a podcast, and I think of an old tree, or as a tree's life. Obviously it's in the realm of hundreds of years or decades, maybe even thousands, depending on the species we're talking about. But you think of a tree as a sapling or as a young tree, and its flexibility and its energy state and its resiliency, and then as it matures and gets older, all the way to retrenchment. I don't think I'm quite at that stage, but if I put myself on a scale, like, I'm not as flexible as I used to be. I'm definitely, I'm a little crustier. I got thicker bark, and eventually you got to get, a little shorter, a little wider to handle what life throws at you, like the wind and the weather, right? And I think that there's such an example in in the forest to our human forest of how to live. And a tree, it more and more, it just astonishes me, not just the withstanding the forces of wind and gravity, but wounds and injuries that occur. things that hurt us and how trees deal with that. But I'm curious where, and I haven't asked anyone this before, so here we go. Tree actions as such being unorganized, but maybe this could be a theme we strike up. What tree you'd put yourself at, as if you think of yourself, what kind of tree and what stage are you at in your life when you compared yourself to a tree right now?
I don't know. I got to think about that one a little bit. I got to.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a tough question to just pop on you, but you don't think too long, 'cause then you don't think of too smart of an answer.
Yeah, well, I'm probably somewhere like a crusty old mangrove at this point, but I don't want to half sunk in the water, and it's just the boat's driving into me, swearing at me all the time. But, that's why I got to think about it, or you'll get an answer like that.
It's a good answer though, and then and maybe that could be a food for thought for folks out there. While you think about that, Blair, do you or have you ever thought that or drawn parallels in your own life from the example of trees, like being involved with trees so long? Have you ever thought of that, or do you feel there is a parallel or to how you live to how trees live?
Well, I mean, for a long time, in some of my presentations, I had pictures of trees that were, when we would go hiking or alpine climbing, you'd see trees that were battered by wind and probably several hundred years old and hanging off the edge of a rock, and you'd see them, and to me that was always just an example of never give up, just keep on going. And I used some of those photos in some of my presentations over the years too, as an example of how we need to live our lives and not be dissuaded by the smallest little things that come along and try and detour us. And so, I think to me, trees are definitely an example of the resiliency that we can have. And, humans have shown that for thousands of years of how resilient we are and how adaptable we are to change. I think sometimes, older trees are not as adaptable as younger trees. And we see this in the urban environment when, people come along and make changes to their properties. We see, young trees are much more resilient to change, and older ones can't accept it. So, I think that's an example of how humans are and what we need to be thinking about as well, because change is inevitable for sure.
That's a good, interesting comment. I wonder, as many parallels as there can be to trees and people, it, and I agree that like older trees would have more difficulty in drastic changes in their environment. And do you think it's the same for people, or can people differ in that way?
No, I think it's definitely the same. I look at my parents and, as you said, you get a bit more crusty, you're cynical as you get older. And we have the ability to change where we live. Of course, trees do not. So they're pretty much stuck putting up with whatever happens around them, whereas, we can change our position if we choose. But, even when I look at my parents, I think they're not adaptable anymore. They're, 86 and 82, and there's no adaptation there. They are what they are. They're not moving.
But isn't it interesting? I'm starting to feel a little bit more like this as I start to scale back my career, so to speak, and certainly not travel as much, which was a huge part of my career. But where I feel more comfortable at home, even in the winter, as much as I like the warm climates and I do escape to there, annually for certain periods of time. But, more and more I find quite a comfort in just home or staying put. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And yeah, that's interesting. And I think it's okay too. And it's, I remember Dr. Shigo, in the later years, him warning me, first of all, Dwayne, the road will eat you alive. Be careful. And then in his later career, he just said, no, you come to me. You want to come to a seminar? I'm holding them at my house. You want to come? You
Yeah.
come here. And he stopped moving around too, which is part of this change business. Very interesting. Um, well, and you're kind of your roots are sinking in where you're at, and it's interesting because you've kind of drawn more back to where you were from.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of tend to do that, and we're talking before the show a little bit about our roots, and you never tend to forget where you came from, and you have a lot of fond memories of growing up, and I think it does kind of draw you back, and of course just even the country and the solitude is great even as you get older. It's just nice to not have the hustle and bustle of a big city around you. When you're young, it's you love it. You're excited about going to the big city and let's get as close to downtown as we can get. And then as you get a little bit older, it's like I need a little more space. I don't quite want this many people standing around me here today.
Not only that, yes, well, yeah, but and the connections are I was going to say the same. You still look for connection, I find, but they're different. Like instead of it being a bunch of people and a dynamic, eclectic environment like a nightclub or downtown, and the energy that you were talking about, because then you definitely get energized. But now it's like I find that connection in like a dog or a horse.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Or a walk in the forest, and you're still seeking that and needing it, but you get it in a different way as you age. And that's fast. I wonder if trees, connect. That's a wild one. That's interesting. Because we talked about how dynamic young trees are, and flexible, and the amount of dynamic energy just in their entire structure. And then as heartwood develops and wound occurs and injuries, and then you develop a different. It's interesting. There's got to be it's an endless parallels, I guess.
Sure is.
You have that. I mean, you definitely. I know horses are part of it for you, for sure, out there, and also just the countryside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we raise purebred Rocky Mountain saddle horses here, and so to get out and go for a tour and enjoy the countryside is definitely a privilege we have here.
It is, and I've been able to enjoy it at least once. I need to come do it again.
Yeah, you do. Just a comment though on your earlier question about being interested in arboriculture and where some of the early ones, and looking back, I've been with Davy Tree now in March. It'll be 40 years that I've been with the company, and the learning opportunities that we have now comparatively to what we had in 1984 or even 1990, whatever, are so much greater with the ability to connect. So I do feel that young folks that are coming into the industry now just have such an opportunity to expand their knowledge and understanding of trees and the whole industry so much better than we had back in the day, because it was a struggle to find information and to learn 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's a very different world. We found that I don't know if the right word is the caliber, but the student that we have in our courses, it's quite different than it was when we started the company back in the early 90s, because they're able to find out so much, information through YouTube or just Instagram, Facebook, whatever. They're watching so many things, and these influencers, as they're called, and it really, I don't know if it's worse than it was before, because we always are a product of what we see and who we're around, and but now that sphere of influence can be expanded digitally, and not everything you see and read on the internet is going to be the best way to go about things. It might look cool, that it may get you in trouble, and so that's an interesting path to navigate, and it just made me think of how have you experienced that? We had Don Blair was one of our first guests, and he went on a bit of a if you have a chance to listen to his podcast. If you haven't, everyone, you should give it a cast. But he talks about the new generation of climber that he feels is leaning less, maybe in some ways, and I don't want to put words in his mouth here, but that people are missing out on the mentoring that occurs when you work at a company and you stay put and you watch and you listen and you learn and you do what you're told. And he said now people do that for like 6 months and they're off contracting and they're climbing the tallest stuff and putting everything on the internet. Is that something that you feel like, you employ a lot of arborists? Is that a struggle or is it a benefit, or how is that playing with your company?
Yeah, it's definitely a struggle, and it's, I think just the ease of advertising, the ease of getting into your own business now, the idea of being your own boss and running your own hours is a huge attraction to younger folks. They don't want to work 40 or 50 hours a week anymore. They want to work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that's it. And they still want to make as much money as they would if they were working 40 or 50 hours a week. So, I don't know where this is going to go, but it's certainly a challenge for all companies. And, I think the internet, the connections people make electronically just are kind of spurring that movement on as well.
I agree. And I don't want to be the old guy that stands in the way of progress, because I don't think that's even possible. Again, I go back to the trees. If a tree grows way too fast, overstimulated, over-fertilized, it tends to break as it gets bigger. And I don't know if there's a similarity there, but how could you impart any of this? If we have some of our younger listeners, how do you gain the mentorship and experience of that some of us have gone through, not necessarily because we wanted to, but out of necessity, because we didn't have these other means of distraction or education, depending on how you look at it. I often wonder what do you suggest to a young person these days getting into the business, and how they, and even this work thing, like, is it a trend that, is our work is 40 hours a week? I heard recently someone say like that in and of itself is antiquated. We have to, that we need to take care of ourselves and have time for ourselves, and like a 20-hour week is going to be more realistic, and that's all you're going to get. It seems like there's a lot of that around these days. And that seems hard for me to understand. But is that a trend? Is it a fad, or is it the way things are going?
Yeah, and that is so true. And when I look back at my career, I can think of 20 or 30 people that I know were much smarter, much more talented than me, but they just didn't have the patience to see it through. They wanted something more right now. And so many of them, left our company, left other companies to do something different. The grass is greener somewhere else. And, the majority of them, from what I know of them, have not been real successful. The odd one has. The majority of them have not been. And so, from my vantage point, I always encourage people to be patient, to see things through, and just, it's the middle miles that are the tough ones. It's not the first 2 miles of a journey that's tough, and it's not the last two. It's always the middle 40 or 50 that when you're running a marathon, that are the tough ones. And so I always encourage people just to see it through, and good things will come. They definitely did for me. And I know that there was a lot of smarter people that I worked with that didn't take advantage of the opportunities that came their way.
Well, if we just look at your career, and with that in mind, the patience element, which I think is a really poignant statement, and very true for me, for sure. I think impatience has affected me to a certain degree in my life. But, your career began from when it began in what, 84, 85?
84, yeah.
84. And how many years before if you track your monument, or what's the word I'm looking for? Significant turning points in your career. What was the time span? I mean, you're at 40 years now. If you, and did you have times where you thought right before that pivotal change, maybe I should do something else, but you stuck it out? Can you give us a timeline of how that went for you? Maybe that's something people could relate to. Like, this is like 40 years. Everyone looks at you now, oh yeah, he's the big guy in charge. But I mean, you started in 84. What were you doing?
Yeah, I mean, in 84, I was dragging brush out of a ditch over a barbed wire fence in the snow, feeding it through a chipper. And, it seemed like I did that forever before I got a chance to climb trees and then move up into a crew foreman, etc. But, I guess when I look back, it was probably a year and a half to 2 years, before I, started being able to, take a little more active role in the leadership on a crew, which is fairly typical in today's environment as well. And then, within 5 years, I was moved into a residential operation and doing sales, part-time climbing. And then a couple of years later, I was managing. So, by 1991, I was running our Edmonton residential office. So that's 6 years into my career.
Right.
And and it was a very small operation. So, it wasn't much at the time. We grew it to be something awesome, but it certainly wasn't at the time. And then in 10 years later, essentially 9 or 10 years later, I moved to Vancouver to take on the role of manager at the coast. And then 10 years later again, I moved up into an operations manager for Western Canada. And several years later, I took on the role that I have now, and I've been doing my current role for about 11 years.
Those milestones, like 6 to 10 year chunks,
They are,
A lot of people, like, that's too long to wait, it seems like, potentially. I don't want to judge anyone, but you, in the middle of that, like you say, that middle of that marathon, there's, life occurs, challenges. But I really do think there's something to be said for that stick-to-itiveness. But not only that, you were talking about energy and bringing that energy. There's something to be said for that too. And the results are in, it gives you the strength to persevere through that time period, but also the growth. Like, there's a few people, obviously, that could have accomplished what you did, not only in your career, but even growing that office in Edmonton from what it was. Like, that was an energy transfer. There was an exchange. Your energy and work translated into that growing and thriving and creating more opportunity for you. I think you'd agree.
I would. And, it's the same for your business. And that's the only reason your business has done as well as it has, is because of your energy. And it literally has been a transfer of energy between you and, all your students and all your trainers. And, it's how they learn, right? You've always said it. Learning takes energy.
Learning requires energy. Yep, you bet. And so does life. And it's interesting. Yeah. Well, Tony, what do you think? You're this energy business.
I'm just curious, Blair, with your 40 years in the industry, what do you think were some of the big turning points in the industry in advancement where things really kind of changed for the better? Because they definitely have, right? I was curious where you would find those turn points.
Yeah, have they ever? And I mean, in the early 90s, when we first started changing the way we climb trees, and I mean, we thought we were, such leading edge at the time. And, now I look at all the gadgets and everything everybody has, and I think it's twice as easy now as it was back then. We were still humping our way up the tree in various ways. And now, even changes like that have been transformational for our industry and have allowed people to do the job now that could never have done it before. And people to do it with a lot less injuries, repetitive injuries, long-term injuries. So yeah, just even in that regard, it has changed dramatically. The scientific end of things, where we've studied the breaking points of trees, insects, disease evolution, and the treatments, and how to manage things, have changed so much in the last 30 years. It's incredible. And I think they've changed far more in the last 30 years than they did in the previous 100 years of the tree industry in North America. So it really is a time for, young folks to step on board and have a great career in our industry, and just be at the forefront of a lot of the changes that have taken place in the last decade.
I agree, and not only that, it certainly seems to be growing. I don't know if where the end is, but it in the last few years, well, particularly since the pandemic, it seems like it's just like a whole. It's like the possibilities just expanded into far greater than what I think that what I would have originally perceived somehow, and I'm curious what you think about the next 30.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, 30 years ago when you said you were an arborist, people said, "A what?" And now you say you're an arborist and people go, "Oh, cool, you work with trees." And, there's still a few people out there that don't know what an arborist is, but most people do. And I think that's kind of the beginning of being recognized as an industry and as a trade. I think it's critical for the next 30 years that our industry does become a proper trade, a red seal trade here in Canada. I don't think we can really make good progress without that. I think having the government, the ITA, the whatever training authority that we're dealing with across Canada, they need to be part of our educational process. We can't be fragmented like we have been for forever, or in some cases non-existent. And so, all those aspects are critical to moving our industry forward. I think there's enough smart people in the business. There's enough well-educated people with PhD behind their name to push our business forward if we can be organized enough to move forward with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, with the recognition and more people knowing what arborists are and being more aware of it, I think that that it's a logical next step that the recognition has to follow through in a more, I guess in Canada, I think of it as a like you say, a red seal or a trade type recognition that where governments or governing bodies can attach some type of standards, I guess, to what gets done and how it gets done, and that will further serve to elevate the professionalism and the I'm curious, do you think that's something that comes from existing associations, or is it something that's going to require a new type of movement of sorts? And certainly, we can speak here from a Canadian perspective. I mean, I think Tony can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe in the U.S. there's the framework has been laid for a trade for arborists, but it hasn't really grown legs at this point yet. I don't think. Is that not true, Tony? Is that?
Yeah, the way it's going to work here in the States, it'll have to go state by state. So there are some states that have taken some very positive steps forward to recognize arboriculture as a trade. And once one state, and then it tends to be a little bit like dominoes, right? Once you get enough dominoes tilting in the right direction, then they all start falling. I think one of the biggest, line clearance arboriculture here is already a trade in the States, right? They have that's already in place. I think probably one of the biggest benefits I think I could see from that is it would just it would open the door to like VOTEC programs, high school level programs. I think a lot more people would get introduced to the work that now, I never are. I came into it. I've never known a world without tree work. My dad, started doing tree work on the year I was born. So I've always seen it, but, I'm the exception, not the rule. I think that when it gets to a trade level, the other side of that is it opens up a whole sea of people, men and women, at a much earlier age to get into this field. For every 10 that comes in, maybe one sticks with it, but, now there's only 10 coming in, whereas if it was recognized more as a trade, if it was taught at vocational schools, if it was seen as something along those lines, like the other trades, like the electrician trades and like the plumbing trades and the welding trades and things like that, then it opens those doors up. And I think that's just improvement across the board. Because there's a lot of very smart people that would really, really excel at this work and would really carve out a nice career and would really do good things for trees and arboriculture. They just don't even know. It's just not even on their radar.
I'm curious, Blair, do you think like the associations have played a role in that? And I don't need to get specific. I think we all know the associations that play and that have a role in the industry, but are we talking about something different? And are they in a position to help us, or is it going to require something more, nation specific, or, what do you see in the role being how that moves forward potentially, like in actually becoming reality, the whole trade business, at least in Canada?
Well, I think we're seeing it move forward here right now. And, from, as Tony mentioned, the utility trade, to me, the utility and the non-utility trade are essentially the same without the electrical part. To me, a utility arborist should have all the skills that a residential arborist should have. They should just know a little bit more, perhaps, about energized lines. And I don't even agree with my own comment on that, but there's some people that do think that there should be a separate designation. To me, if you're an arborist, you should be able to work anywhere in a tree, regardless of what's around it, and have the knowledge to perform that service, regardless if it's energized power lines or a glass pool room below you. So, to me, an arborist is an arborist, and I've worked both sides of it. I've spent 20 years in residential and 15 to 20 years in utility, and I think an arborist is an arborist, but not everybody's going to agree with me. So baby steps. I think we'll probably see a utility red seal in Canada before we'll see a residential red seal, just because the utilities are driven by the utility companies, and most of the the driving force is around safety component of it, and incident frequency, how to reduce those incidents, and that's education. I mean, there's just no other way around that. Well-trained, educated people have a much less risk of getting injured or injuring those around them. Much less chance of having an unplanned event.
Right. And it seems, what seems to be the reason, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, but in the utility realm, like even in the United States, you have a trade. It's more recognized. And I think the utilities bring something that we lack in the residential marketplace, and that is the utilities bring, well, first of all, they bear a liability because of their infrastructure that they manage. And that infrastructure is quite valuable, and there's resources attached to that and income. And they have the resources to support a trade-like service. And there's an obligation to ensure safety of the workers around that infrastructure. Whereas when you're dealing with residential commercial, there's resources there and there's money to be made. Obviously, I mean, companies strive doing it or thrive doing residential commercial tree work. But for some reason, you talked about incidents and preventing those, that we have proof of incidents in the residential commercial marketplace, but yet there isn't, there isn't like a group of people like a utility that have the resources to invest in making something like recognized as a trade? Or is that, like, what is it that keeps, we know the fatality statistics, they're not in the utility sector, they're in the residential commercial sector, and we're not talking injuries, we're just talking deaths that we know are high, and yet we struggle to have these programs for the residential marketplace. Why do you think that is?
Well, I kind of hate to say this, but everybody, is afraid of organized labor, and I think we need to get past that. That's the first thing that people need to move on past, that worry, because it's not really a worry. It's
okay.
It's just another factor potentially another factor of our business. The other, reason that I think people sort of don't push training forward is because they feel like they're going to train their people and lose them. So they don't want to give them any more than they have to. They don't want to invest any more into them than they have to. But I think, the organizations, whether it be ISA, TCI, they have moved our industry forward immensely. And I think, the associations are still the venue to move them forward. I think that's our medium for, people getting together and moving education and the industry forward.
Yeah, it's a interesting topic. And, I've been outspoken and passionate about it for years, I built my, this business on genuinely, it was to improve the knowledge of arborists to help keep people safe, and having friends that died early in the career, being exposed to the consequences of this business, in a real hard and fast way. And then realizing that it's not as uncommon as I thought, and that just driving me to try to bring that awareness. Really, it was about like curing ignorance through education. And then it's up to you to make a choice. And, that's where we're at today. I think, people have to make that choice. It's not legislated. It's not organized. You don't have to be a journeyman arborist. You don't even need training, but it's worker beware, kind of like, instead of buyer beware.
Exactly.
And it really is in this business, and that's always been what I strive to tell people, just know what can happen and what has happened to 100+ people every year, that maybe if they just knew the risks going into it, they might have made a different decision. And that's the best we can do right now. And I'd like to see that be a little different, but, I think so much of it comes down to what we were talking about earlier, is that energy and what you're passionate about and willing to give. And then you also mentioned change. And I think that's a big part of it too, is the fear of that. The fear of change is something to be feared and resisted. And it's a chronic issue in so many parts of our life and careers.
That's where the youth comes in, not afraid of change.
Yeah. And here we have an old timber talking about not to be afraid of change. So there you go.
It's the only thing sure in our life is change and death, of course. But
yeah. Well, this has been a great podcast as always, and I've appreciated your insights and your honesty, Blair. I've always appreciated that about you and your candor, and thank you for agreeing to be on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Dwayne. I really appreciate it. And it was a great opportunity to discuss this.
Yes. Well, I appreciate chatting with you too, Blair. And thanks for agreeing on such short notice. And
yes, thank you. And same to you guys.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blair. We appreciate having you on.
Goodbye for now, guys.
Bye, Blair.